Hey, good morning everyone. Welcome to this learning session on industrial cybersecurity and system resilience hosted by Polestar and Tech Data. We have called this webinar a roadmap to industrial system resilience, given that we will be first introducing to you about the importance of keeping your day-to-day operations up and running. Second, we will be also discussing on which are some of the threats that menace the operational continuity of your industrial networks and OT systems, therefore of your business. Third, talking about some of the latest trends on resilience and cybersecurity that you need to consider to minimize and prevent those risks. Fourth, we'll be showing you the basics on how to perform a risk analysis to prioritize areas of work and determine the cybersecurity and resilience projects that you should be implementing. Fifth, and summarizing, we will put together the main takeaways of the session in the shape of a step-by-step roadmap that you can follow to embrace a resilience strategy in your industrial organization. So, today we have Julian, CEO of Polestar, Andy, Cybersecurity and Networks Engineer at Polestar, and Matthew, who is the Product Specialist at Tech Data. Please say hi guys and introduce yourselves.
So thanks Mario. So just a little bit about me. I started off my career as an information security engineer, installing firewalls into places like power stations and building high security hosting facilities in data centers and decommissioned nuclear bunkers for ISPs. I'm a founder of Polestar, and as well as leading the company, I work closely with our partners to help our customers integrate their people, processes, and technology with their IoT, IT, and industrial control environments. And we also have Andy with us, who is our systems engineer at Polestar, and Matthew from Tech Data. I'll let Andy introduce himself first.
Hi everyone, I'm Andy Llewellyn. I'm a systems engineer for Polestar. So it's down to me to deliver the kind of systems that we're going to talk about. My focus is mostly high availability systems, hosting systems and networking, with a focus on industrial.
Okay, I'm Matt Carver. I run the enterprise software pre-sales team at Tech Data, who supply Polestar. And my role there, apart from running the team, is I look after Veeam and VMware. And I'm also a certified Veeam instructor. So that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about later on in this webinar.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So I will kick off on the first topic of the agenda. I'll just share my screen, just bear with me. So over the last couple of years, and especially with all the trials and tribulations of COVID-19, we've seen industrial companies recognize and respond to the challenges that have been forced upon them, as well as their supply chains. Digitalization, the buzzword du jour, is one of those challenges, and the drive to propel the business in the right direction by designing new production processes and implementing new communication infrastructures to increase operational flexibility has come from the top down and the bottom up, and it's now part of the DNA within every business. Processes traditionally are only capable of being performed on premise that are now being performed remotely, some of these in the cloud. And these are low-hanging fruits and industrial control and monitoring, machinery commissioning and asset tracking applications. However, the pandemic has also affected the mobility of the workforce, and businesses have had to accelerate their digital transformation journey by exposing data points from control systems to ERP systems and vice versa to drive efficiencies. We've also noticed a dramatic increase in projects relating to improving connectivity, the implementation of collaborative and cloud-first technologies using tools like industrial remote access platforms, IIoT platforms, other SaaS and even video conferencing apps. And by 2025, Computer Weekly say we will have about 37 billion devices connected to the industrial internet. The urgent and reactive approach may lead companies to link their IT and OT systems insecurely or incompletely or both, leaving them exposed to threats like ransomware, which is grabbing a lot of headlines right now, and particularly the recent attack on JBS. However, that's not the whole story, and production equipment and networks are also prone to failures of operational, electrical, mechanical, communication, and even human failures. Usually human error causes around 23% of unplanned downtime in manufacturing. As you can see here, some of the projects that businesses are implementing to create efficiencies and deliver continuous improvements. And with these push-pull factors, businesses are attracting threats that we need to prevent or minimize through the implementation of resilient systems to reinforce continuity. And we've called this the Mobius strip paradox. If you don't take an end-to-end approach, you could quickly take your industrial systems down to the other side of the strip and into a scenario where security and continuity breaches create the opportunity for cyber attacks and unplanned downtime with their respective business impacts. Staying on course, moving in the right direction, requires dynamic planning along with expertise to stay safe and secure. And new ways of working, collaboration through practicing agility and empowering DevSecOps teams enables organizations to test, refine, release new products and functionality more rapidly and frequently than ever before, maintaining security and compliance postures. But before jumping into the solutions to this paradox, I want to highlight some of the impacts to business operations and its infrastructure. Besides the obvious operational unplanned downtime, you could be exposing your data and your assets to loss and risking your company to reputational damages and financial penalties. And that can be worse than the actual cause itself. So even when you have planned downtime in manufacturing, you're not only losing productivity, but delays, potentially unhappy staff, customers, and lost revenue. And the cost of downtime isn't easy to quantify, but for some of our customers, it's north of 200K per hour, some of them much more so. And according to the Manufacturer magazine, overall, the impact of machine downtime is costing Britain's manufacturers more than £180 billion a year. And as you will hear, our customers are being targeted for ransomware. We don't want to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt and sell you a remedy. But what we do want to do today is to help inform you, the decision makers and representatives of your organizations, how to prevent and how to protect yourselves from major downtime and operational loss in the event of a severe cyber incident. We've been working in industrial environments for many years, and we have customers with technology, some of them over 30 years old. So getting visibility on these assets is a major problem. And even if you have the knowledge within the business to make the right decisions about which devices can communicate with each other, the secure approach that is taken is usually to ring-fence the assets by installing multiple firewalls at zone and cell levels. And this doesn't help with data acquisition, and users may find ways around these restrictions. And we've seen wireless doing this as a classic example. And while IT systems have standardized on network protocols like TCP/IP, OT systems, of course, use a wide array of protocols, many of which are specific to functions, industry, and geographies. And this can create a challenge as security managers have to create disparate systems to secure their environment. Cyber attacks also target devices by focusing on the wide variety of OT protocols in place. Perimeter protection between enterprise and OT is often deployed using these firewalls, but that may mean the OT and automation teams have to deploy additional specialist security devices. And this doesn't always solve the problem, as we know that most hacks come through the enterprise services and not as you would probably accept through the industrial control systems. And this is due to the high number of services that require to be opened in an enterprise for information workers to do what they need to do. A study performed by one of our IT security partners concluded that while ransomware and other external threats have news media attention, the respondents' top overall concern was for devices and things that cannot protect themselves, which is highly related to issues with security configurations at 44%, followed by internal threats and accidental issues at 43%. So the overall concerns are really internal threats and accidents, and the increasing presence of connected devices, many insecure by design in and around ITS environments. And I'll hand over to Matthew next.
Okay, right. Before I start my bit, just to say something that Mario has just sent out in the chat. If you have any questions going on, there is a Q&A in Zoom. Just type your questions in there. We'll try and answer them as we go along. Okay, threats to the industrial systems and OT networks. So you've got malware, right, which is designed to attack your system, but ransomware is a specific type of malware that's not just designed to do harm, it's designed to encrypt your data and hold it to ransom. That's been actually started back in 1989, the first bit of ransomware, but it's only gained notoriety in recent years with attacks like WannaCry back in 2017. And since then, we've only seen a rise, and it may not have been in the news all the time. There's the odd bit that's been in the news, TravelX, etc. Yeah. But what we have seen is a move from this scattergun type approach that they started out with, just hit everything. And hopefully we will hit something of value, to a targeted approach. So the ransomware organizations, the people behind it, are these days organized crime gangs, not just kids sat in rooms. There tend to be organized crime gangs behind it, targeting specific businesses, specific industries, looking to make money. And more worryingly, we've seen a recent shift to ransomware as a service, where just like a traditional sort of SaaS type environment, the people behind the ransomware code, you can go and basically buy an attack. So you can buy the code, the mechanism for launching the attack, and in some cases you can even have customer services for support during your attack. Yeah. A lot of the attacks, if they're not ransomware designed to encrypt things, a lot of the attacks will be looking at stealing credentials. Even generally, the ransomware attacks start with some way of getting into the business. So getting hold of some credentials by phishing, that gets them in, then they can start to do the attack. So different types of IoT technologies can present the vulnerabilities, right? Things like passive RID readers, Wi-Fi cellular systems, NFC communications. A lot of these devices that we've got on our IoT networks, our OT networks, have firmware that has, in some cases, poor code on it, offering backdoors, particularly if you haven't changed the default passwords as well. That can be a big problem. And once they get into those to set up their attack, then we're in trouble. So sort of places that we need to look out for. Corrupted packets on our OT networks can open the door. Insecure system configurations. So things like NTP, DNS, DHCP, if they're not being secured. But NTP, it's all too easy to do a sort of man-in-the-middle attack with that. Just spoof an IP address and sit in the middle. Unprotected devices are ones you've not changed the default passwords on, ones you've not updated the firmware on, and then lack of maintenance on all your systems, potentially, any one of those systems, right the way from the IoT things to your main infrastructure with Windows servers on Linux. If you've not been patching the vulnerabilities, then they can be exploited. Even if we're keeping everything else tight and secure, then there's always a possibility of human error. What I've got a screenshot on here is a sort of typical phishing email. So sent to users. Just click on the link. It's either going to take them to a dodgy website, or it's going to download a piece of code, depending on what the attack was designed to do. I think this one, it actually took them to a website and automatically downloaded a piece of code. We have other types of emails. I've seen quite a lot trying to mimic a particular business and saying it's time to change your password. Click on this link, put your current password in. Yeah, they've got your credentials and it all looked completely genuine. So employees can quite easily and unwillingly install malware through these emails, through games, USB devices, of course, as well. And then we've got things within the IT teams. And it's quite challenging to maintain all of the security stuff. So and all the other patching that you've got to do. So all these next generation firewalls that you might have securing all your OT networks, etc. If they have to manage and update those, then I'm not talking here about forgetting to update them. We talked about on the other slide, but accidentally putting a patch that you haven't done testing on, can cause downtime. It can cause expose you to additional threats, even though you're updating the code on that firewall. You can actually, until you've done the necessary testing on it and know what extra functionality it adds in, you can accidentally cause yourself an issue. So the final thing, other threats. So not malware, but other things that can cause you problems. Yeah, so overheating and physical damage. So I've done a lot of work in the past with a particular NHS trust up in Scotland. And I can remember them, one of the computer rooms, it had 4 air conditioning units, but what they didn't know, because they'd inherited this room, was they all went to the same condenser on the outside. One day I turned up to do some work and the whole computer room was shut down because the condenser had frozen, and it actually shut down all their servers, but it also damaged their storage because the storage didn't shut down. It actually damaged some of the disks in the storage. Fortunately, they were replicating their machines, and they were also replicating their backups that were on some of these storage systems as well. And they were able to bring up everything on the other site. They had copies of their backups on the other site. So no harm done, except obviously repairing the physical damage. But if they hadn't had those resilience in place, they'd have been in real trouble. And just a little meme for you there. You can spend lots of money on security, but if you don't educate your users, then you've left the back door.
Thanks, Matthew. That's grand. I will just share that, hopefully, the right screen. I think my video's dropped out again, so I do apologise for that. Let's have a vote. I think, Mario, you were putting a vote together on how well prepared folks feel their organisations are ready to face some of the challenges, basically.
Yeah, we have a poll, so I'm going to launch it so you can answer the question, please.
Be great to see some of your feedback. So while you're doing that, I'd just like to talk about the next topic for the agenda today, which is trends and some of the solutions available. Industrial companies can rely today not only on technology solutions, but also methodologies that describe how to safely integrate different systems, build effective working teams, both IT and OT, and deploy zero trust security frameworks. And they not only help reduce complexity and simplify management of industrial control systems, but also ensure that reliability, availability, and integrity can be maintained. And then generally, we classify these methodologies as preventative or corrective solutions. So Mario, have we got any results in?
Yeah, we got some people that mentioned that most of them have cybersecurity and resilience systems and processes in place. Just a few mentioned that they are currently planning a cybersecurity or resilience project. And another one said that they have installed some firewalls and backups, but they have still plenty of room to improve.
Great stuff. Okay. So what I want to talk about quickly are some of the preventative solutions. So what you can do is, firstly of all, in terms of compliance with standards and policies, standards like IEC 62443 for OT teams, NIST, and NERC CIP can be effective, especially when protecting industrial control systems for national infrastructure. But for manufacturers, this can be too costly due to the management overhead, as they have a very large number of disparate assets and some very large factories. On the other hand, the creation of policies does lay out a company's objectives, and organizations can measure progress towards these goals by implementing and testing security postures to achieve them. Secondly, secure architectures and systems. Designing and constructing multi-layered defense in depth systems to address threats to business continuity is a primary objective for most businesses, to share data with their supply chains and their customers. Cloud services offer massive opportunities for collaboration, and using the right cloud technology can bring IT and OT and automation teams together. Cloud security can arguably be said to be more secure than any number of perimeter and common access firewalls, if implemented correctly. Cloud platforms can also provide transparency and security by design, and by routing industrial data through more securely controlled SD-WANs and next generation firewalls, you can reduce the attack surface and number of data points that are to be exposed across the entire enterprise. Visibility. According to a survey performed by one of our OT security vendors, organizations are implementing specialist software such as vulnerability scanning, 63% of them, security awareness training, 59%, and industrial intrusion prevention systems, 47%. ICS/OT configuration management is the most frequently named new initiative, which is not surprising, and that's where budgets are available. Organizations are making security assessment and audits to gain greater visibility into control system assets, data, configurations are their top priorities. Network traffic segmentation and traffic monitoring is the other side of the puzzle. Putting in place structures and tools necessary to control and monitor what is happening between your automation zones, cells, and corporate networks. When you gain visibility into both process anomalies and security anomalies on a control network, you can establish control points limiting access to different zones of your network. And with greenfield sites, this isn't difficult to achieve with physical segmentation. But with brownfield sites, it's not so easy. And one way around this is by overlaying software-defined segmentation. And by using industrial Ethernet switches and cybersecurity software, we can provide the means to securely implement policies across production systems. And this can be done at scale and in a cost-effective way by replacing legacy switches in brownfield sites with rugged components and managing the organization's security posture through software-based policy nodes. I'll hand you back over to Matthew to talk about some of the corrective solutions.
The threat of ransomware is real. Veeam have had situations where people haven't planned for it, haven't thought about their resilience in their backups, and actually had situations where ransomware has encrypted or deleted people's backups. So Veeam actually have a specialist support team that do actually deal with people that have been subject to ransomware attacks. So how can Veeam help? The first thing is in ransomware detection, there is a product produced by Veeam that's part of Veeam Availability Suite. There are two ways to buy Veeam backup. You can buy it on its own, or you can buy something called the Veeam Availability Suite, which includes Veeam One. Veeam One for over 4 years has had logic in place in some of its alarms to alert you about possible ransomware activity. Right? So this alarm, possible ransomware activity. It basically looks for very high CPU usage of very high disk write I/O, which could indicate there is encryption going on. Could be other things, but it would alert you to go and have a look and make sure it's a legitimate process causing that rather than something else. The other thing that's been in since version 10, it's had another alarm that alerts you to suspiciously large incremental backup sizes, right, which is indicating a lot of change happening on that particular system, because with incremental backups, we only backup change blocks. If there's a lot of change going on and you're not expecting that because you haven't done dumped a whole lot of new data on it, then that should be immediately go and have a look what's going on in that system. Other things that we recommend is keep the enemy guessing. Right? We support lots of different storage as backup repositories. You could leverage that by using different file systems, different protocols for your backup storage. So you could use Linux-based repositories, maybe some deduplication appliances, a hardened Linux repository that I'll talk about later on as well. And by having these different ones, the chances of them both getting hit by ransomware is extremely remote. Other things you could do is, unless you're copy your backups to the cloud, then there is, or you're backing up things from the cloud as well, then there is no real need to have it connected to the internet apart from applying the updates, but you can get the updates separately. So you can get the updates from a machine that is connected to the internet and install them on your Veeam environment separately. So don't give it access to the internet if it doesn't need it. If it does need it, restrict it to specific addresses and specific ports that are required. All the backup vendors talk about a 3-2-1 rule, which is have 3 different copies of your data. One of that is the production data, so 2 copies of the backup on 2 different media types, one of which should be offsite. And these days we also talk about that one also being offline as well to protect against ransomware. And Veeam also talk about, they add a 0 on the end. The idea with a 0 is Veeam backup and replication has the capability to verify your backups by actually doing a test on their recoverability into an isolated environment, actually powering up the virtual machines off of the backup in an isolated environment, testing that it boots, testing the application comes up, right? So you know it's recoverable, you know it's going to work. So if you're going to be certain of your backups or some copies of your backups not actually being hit by ransomware, not being deleted by ransomware or an attack, then you should have one copy that's ultra resilient. And the only way to do that is to have it offline, have it air gapped, or have it on something that is immutable. Right. So, and that can, the immutability can protect us over time, or the air gaps. Right, so I'm going to talk about the ways in which we can achieve that resilience. So good old-fashioned tape. Yeah. Tape, when it's not in the library or not in the drive, it's offline. It can't be modified, it can't be written to. I know it's kind of old-fashioned, but it works. Yeah. And in some business sectors, it's actually a requirement for them to have it. Replicated virtual machines. Replicated virtual machines, they're powered off, providing the attack isn't targeting the hypervisor. Then when a virtual machine is powered off, it isn't going to be modified. Yeah. So if the ransomware is targeting Windows and you happen to be on a vSphere environment, yeah, it's can't talk to a powered off Windows virtual machine. Therefore, it should be, in that case, perfectly safe. All right. Primary storage snapshots can be used for quick rollback, and Veeam can actually automate those primary storage snapshots. They are more of a rollback mechanism unless they're being replicated to another disk array, because if the primary disk should fail in some way, go back to the overheating example, then you can't roll back to a snapshot. So unless they're being replicated somewhere, not really a backup, but it is a method that lets us roll back very, very quickly. Veeam Cloud Connect, so you can replicate your backups, so you can replicate your virtual machines as well. So a Veeam cloud provider, and that's sat in, that goes across a completely different authentication mechanism. It's sat in someone else's data center. It's using SSL encryption to copy it across there. Ransomware isn't going to jump. There's not a permanent VPN in place. Ransomware isn't going to jump from your environment to the cloud provider's environment. In terms of things you could do yourself, you can, for a Veeam backup repository, have it actually created on rotated hard drives. So you could swap the hard drives out periodically, and even obviously take them off site as well to give you extra resilience. And then there's immutable backups. So immutable backups are supported on AWS S3. Quite a few S3 storage systems. So there's different sorts of software that you can buy to do that. There are quite a few providers out there in the cloud that you can go to, as well as AWS, that do that. And there's also that came in with version 11 earlier this year, this hardened Linux repository. So that's a Linux server with disk and XFS file system, and it uses a one-time password to talk to it. So even if Veeam, someone should target Veeam with malware, right, it isn't going to get the password to actually have admin rights to do anything on there, and the backups will be marked as immutable. Immutable backups means they can't be deleted for a set period of time. They can't be modified. It's like having a read-only copy. Yeah? It's like a worm drive, if you want, yeah, for the set immutability period. So I talked about S3 type storage. I talked about the need to have an offsite copy. So there's a fairly easy way to achieve this with Veeam Backup, and that is the scale-out backup repository. So the scale-out backup repository will have what we call the performance tier, which is our local backup storage. And then it would have the capacity tier, which is object-based storage, usually in the cloud. And what came in with version 10, we're now on version 11, is the ability to say within your scale-up backup repository, as soon as my backup lands here on the performance tier, immediately copy it to the capacity tier. And with S3 compatible storage that supports immutability, or AWS S3, you can actually set that backup to be immutable when it's copied across for a set period of time. And to give you an idea of the kind of level of resilience that would give you, if you try to delete that restore point sitting on an S3 bucket marked as immutable, if you try to delete it within the Veeam console, it would tell you no, it would fail to do it. If you went into, if it was AWS, if you went into the AWS portal and tried to delete it as well, tried to delete the S3 bucket, it isn't going to let you. Nothing can modify that until the immutability flag on that file expires. So if you set it to be immutable for 6 months, nothing can do anything with that file for 6 months. And that's as easy as ticking a box, right? So what we're actually looking at here is the hardened Linux repository that came in with version 11. Yeah, but the immutability feature, as I say, is also available on a lot of S3 storage. So when you're setting up an immutable Linux repository, it's an install of something like Ubuntu on a server. You format the disk you want to put your backups on with the XFS file system, and there's scripts to do this, available from Veeam. And when you're setting it up in Veeam, you tick a box saying how long you want any files written to this to be immutable for. And that uses the immutability flag in Linux and marks that as immutable. And that backup cannot be deleted or modified for that period of time. If you tried to delete it in Veeam, it would fail. If you went in Linux and tried to delete it, it would also fail to do it. The other important thing is we have this single-use credentials with a non-root account to talk from the Veeam backup server to this hardened Linux repository. Initially, we talk to it with a set of credentials, single-use password, go and set everything up with root type privileges, and then we revert to using a non-root account to talk to it. So if something attacked Veeam and tried to then attack this repository server, it isn't going to be able to do anything because it won't have the privileges to do so. Other things that can help with ransomware attacks, apart from making our backups immutable against ransomware attacks, is we have a feature called Secure Restore. So when we're coming to do a restore, if we've been hit by some malware, or we think we've got some malware, then when we go to do the restore, we can select we want to do something called a secure restore. And that simply tells, before we start the restore process, the mount server, the server that can see that backup image, which is typically the repository, to actually do an antivirus scan, invoke an antivirus scan, and scan the backup using a command line to invoke it. And then we can choose what to do if it's found to have an infection. We can either say, well, if it's got no infection, restore it back to the original location. If it's infected, we can choose restore, but don't connect the networks, gives us a chance to remove the infection. Or we can say, discard it, abort the restore. We'll try another older restore point. We also have this thing called stage restore. This isn't marketed heavily by Veeam for this use case, but I think it's a really good one. It was actually designed to be able to remove data from backups where we were restoring a crashed database where there was data about something that shouldn't be there anymore because somebody's done something like invoked their right to be forgotten. But it can be used in this type of scenario. So imagine a scenario where you got hit by ransomware because there was a vulnerability that hadn't been patched, or you got hit by malware. You got hit by something, some kind of attack that exploited a vulnerability in one of your systems that you hadn't patched. The last thing that you'd want to do when you restore that server to replace the one that's been attacked is restore it with the same vulnerability in place. What stage restore allows you to do is bring up that machine that you're trying to restore with any prerequisites. So if it's a domain member, for example, and it needs a domain controller, you can bring that up with a backup of a domain controller in an isolated virtual lab, so isolated from the main network, and execute a script in that machine that either applies the patch to fix that vulnerability or blocks the ports, for example, that would need to be open to exploit that vulnerability, and then migrate that machine to production, with some kind of fix in place that you've executed via that script.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, cracking. I mean, there's some really interesting features there, Matt, and I didn't know about. It's good to hear some of those, the older technologies like Worm being useful, even in this day and age. And it just goes to show that, recycling some of those ideas can actually be really, really, really handy. So great. Okay, so let's have a quick run through building a roadmap to resilience. We've talked about the threats that ICS and automation systems are exposed to, and some of the preventative measures that can be put in place to ensure continuity. But how do you build the business case to get the funding to mitigate these risks if you don't have a budget especially? And where do you start classifying, analysing and evaluating the risks? So we put together a 6-step process, and it's an approach that we've used and refined in collaboration with our partners and our customers to determine which areas to focus on and what the right order needs to be to build that system's resilience. First of all, defining the assessment areas in systems. In the first instance, it helps to identify the information and assets that could be affected by a cyber attack or a disruption in operations. And it's important to document how resources are used and how they connect to each other. We recommend that you do this at the application level for all the applications in use at your facility. You could do this for each level of the Purdue model, for example. In this slide, we have the model of a SCADA system, and we show connectivity flowing from south to north throughout the organisation. And note how we organise this information in a cascade structure to easily visualise relationships and hierarchies between the systems. At the same time, it also helps us identify the handoffs between the responsible owners, and we assign an owner at each level. Using the RACI matrix can be helpful here. Secondly, the next step is to evaluate which applications are the most vulnerable and what system dependencies might be required for them to function. For the example of SCADA previously, you might require Active Directory and SQL. If you use monitoring applications on smartphones, tablets, or HMIs, then you should also be aware that the attacks on these devices are becoming much more common. And that was up 600% in 2019, so they should be factored in as well. Estimating the RTO and RPO times is not rocket science. Most OT teams will have a rough idea of what these will be, and starting off with a wild guess is fine. Just get something down and you can return to it later. Incidentally, if you aren't familiar with RTO and RPO, the RTO is a recovery time objective, and that's the duration of time and service level within which a business process must be restored after a disaster or a disruption in order to avoid unacceptable consequences associated with a break in continuity. The recovery point objective, RPO, describes the amount lost measured in time. So for an example, after an outage, if the last available good copy of data was from 18 hours ago, then the RPO would be 18 hours. RTOs and RPOs vary within organizations and system types, particularly if production systems are being managed by engineering teams, for example, or if OT is outsourced by third parties or IT auto IT departments. Recovery and response times will also depend on what resources your company have available. For instance, when virtualization systems in place, RPOs and RTOs can decrease. And big hint there, Veeam does help with this. Mario's just going to introduce a short poll while I grab a quick drink.
Yes, I'm going to launch a poll here about RPOs and RTOs. Please vote. The poll is already live to you for voting.
Great. So have you already tested your company RTOs and RPOs, or do you test them on a regular basis maybe?
I think we got all the answers now.
Okay, so here we go. 25. Yeah, I mean 75% defining them and what are RPOs. So yeah, I mean you're in good company. Most people we find don't really test them ever. Unfortunately, the only time that they're tested is when an incident occurs. It would be nice, and wouldn't it be nice to be able to have the time and the shutdown time to do these properly, but unfortunately, it's not always the case that we can do that unless it's one of these critical incidents. Okay, so let's move on. Thirdly, we need to define what those risks and vulnerabilities look like. And by this time, it's time to think which of those are most likely to happen in your specific production environment, so you can start categorizing them. And common potential threats might include unauthorized access, misuse of information, failed processes or machine failures, data loss and corruption, disruption of service, disasters, which can be man-made or natural. And notice you don't have to be very specific at this. It's a really high level for now. What information is at risk and how likely is it to happen? And within each category, you might want to list all the potential risks for an application or a service and then apply a mean value to keep it simple. You can then assess compliance with existing policies and best practices if you're lucky to have them, to help determine the risk likelihood. Fourthly, by now, you should be in a position to list all of those potential risks and rate them on a scale of low, medium, and high. And again, keeping it simple. KISS is a really, really good approach to take with this. A classification of risks might be as follows: low risk items, which might include local servers that contain product specification information, such as CAD drawings, for example, representing little to no damage or financial impact. Medium risks, and this might be items that might be required for business operations, such as controlling environmental factors for building management systems. And these might have a noticeable impact on the business with a short-term financial impact. And then high risk, which is the business critical stuff, such as laboratory information management data for compliance reasons, recipes, PLC code, etc. And losing access to this data could cause not just operational problems, but also reputational problems. And baby milk was a famous example of this happening a few years ago, or an infamous example, I should say. Fifth, map the risk levels out and then conduct an analysis to determine how likely a risk scenario is going to occur and what that financial impact could have on the business if it were to occur. But this is quite tricky, but most organizations have a fairly good idea of what the financial impact would be at a process level. So take that figure out, and it can be derived by compiling a list of all of the processes used in a particular product line, for example, is one way of cracking that nut. And this analysis will help prioritize what parts of the production network and what parts of the corporate network's infrastructures will need securing first, particularly where they cross over. Sixth, the sixth stage is the most interesting part. It's the gap analysis, and it's performed to compare your current performance with your desired expected performance. And the outcome of this stage will give you two choices, basically. Firstly, you can develop policy benchmarks to use for operational purposes and monitor the results at appropriate intervals, or develop an action plan with a report, define some budgets and a prioritized project list that includes a selection of the controls and systems to treat the identified risks. And this plan could also include an explanation of the roles and responsibilities to be assigned to the people in charge of your company's cybersecurity and resilience. Or if those roles don't exist yet, it could be the basis of where you can build a virtual team, or even if you're lucky enough to get an external resource to fill in for that. So to assist with the business case, you can refer out to international standards such as ISO 27001 or IEC 62443 to help defining the technical and process aspects of cybersecurity projects. Finally, the resiliency roadmap, or putting it all together as we call it. We've completed the auditing, we've identified the risks and performed the gap analysis, and we know the priority of what we need to be looking for when choosing between different technology stacks. But when you need to choose a product or a service to fill a gap, which one should you choose, especially when it comes to cybersecurity? I think it helps to bear in mind that most of the products and services on the market are broadly comparable. So you will cover off, say, 80% of your requirements by choosing any potential vendor or technology to fill a gap. But it's the remaining 20% that's the important bit. And we always advise that getting the infrastructure right first and having a minimum viable product mindset will help deliver the quickest route to value of that remaining 20%. And remembering what is the problem I am trying to solve will define the shortest path and the path of least resistance to the testing, evaluation and deployment of the right processes, procedures, and systems to provide the appropriate levels of cybersecurity and resilience for the business. I think that's me over to back to Mario, I think, for the Q&As, Mario.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for this amazing session. Thank you, Matthew and Julian. So we're going to head to the Q&As. We've got a few questions in the chat box. I don't know which of you are going to solve this one. Somebody asked, what are your thoughts that the Purdue model is broken when you consider level 1 devices, which may look to use an IoT service or a sensor communicating conditioning events directly to the cloud over 4G, 6FOX, LoRaWAN, but securely, rather than being routed internally?
Shall I kick off with that one, and then I'll hand over to the people that really know this stuff. I mean, at the end of the day, I am just a gob on legs, but I think it's been broken for a long time. The thing to bear in mind really is that you've got the capability to monitor some of your devices, and that should be distinct from the ability to control those devices. So I mentioned in one of the slides traffic moving from south to north, and it's really important that you build those levels that I put in one slide, so you can see who's responsible and where that data flow needs to go. So if it's going out onto a 4G network, then what controls have you got in place that the vendor who's put that in, or the vendor that you're buying that service from, can guarantee that it's only data that's being monitored going over, and it's a one-way system. I don't think you can get anybody who would be able to guarantee that without putting things like data diodes in place. So for me, I would pretty much route all of my data, if it was wireless traffic or low power WAN or traffic or whatever, through a gateway that's on my side of the cloud, and then push that out to cloud through that. So at least I've got visibility of the data that's going out in that respect. And it is possible to do that. But Andy, I mean, I think you probably got some strong thoughts on this stuff. You see a lot of it in place.
Yeah, so does this mean that the model is broken? I'd say it doesn't necessarily mean the model is broken, but it says that here we're bypassing it. What we're talking about is taking an opaque black box, running some software with its own route of communication, and then connecting it into our physical environment and trusting it with no visibility in its traffic and no control over what it does, other than what we physically connected it to. Is that a risk? Yes, I would say it was. So all we can do is take these sort of things on a case-by-case basis, evaluate the company that it comes from, ideally evaluate their software development methods and teams, just to see what protections we've got from malicious actors in their company or in the software supply chain, putting components in there that are going to do us harm. So the kind of segmentation that we're trying to achieve is a tool to protect us from these things. It's not the complete solution, I suppose, is the truth of it. This is one example where we've got a device that we can't monitor what it's doing. But even if we had a perfect scenario where our entire network, we knew every node and we knew every protocol and every communication that we could expect every node to make to every other node, that does still not entirely protect us. For example, we've been recently seeing a bit of an increase in Active Directory type attacks. So suppose our SCADA servers and our consoles, etc., are all Active Directory enabled, and somehow bad actors manage to get in and do something with group policy that installs malware on every Active Directory enabled computer. other than the initial access into the domain controller in the first place, all of the other communications would be totally expected. And segmentation didn't entirely help us with that environment. It's helped us with thousands of other threats, but there's always going to be a way that if we're not secure end to end, there's always going to be a door, a back door somewhere, a way that somebody's going to try and find to get in and sneak in under our radar, if you like. But yes, black box IIoT devices do certainly give a lot of potential for that, I would say. So I'm not sure the model's broken, but bypassing it is something that we should do with a good deal of caution.
And I think segmentation and overlays can help with that. I mean, the other thing that came to mind actually when you were talking about that, Andy, was that, you know, from years and years ago, I remember seeing exploits being used where folks were inserting corporate sensitive data at packet level and fragmenting these so they could go over low power wide area networks, as they were back then, still are. So there are ways in exfiltration is certainly one of those techniques that can use one-way traffic, unfortunately, once a bad actor manages to get their hands on it. So I think you're right there. I think bypassing is something that needs to be done on a case-by-case basis, really, for most organizations. And you know, the business case has to, I think, it demand that, really.
Yeah, and would you do that for a device that was from, I don't know, pick a company out there, a reputable company, say a Siemens device from a team that you knew well and you'd been working with for years? You might do. Would you do that for a device that you just bought for 15 quid off of eBay? Probably not.
Probably not.
Case by case basis.
Yeah, very, very true. At the end of the day, it's like the old IBM adage, isn't it?
All right. Yeah, we have another question here. Somebody's asking, is testing RPOs and RTOs something achievable in real life?
I think this is definitely a question for Matt.
It is, yeah. So if those systems that you want to test are running in virtual machines, such as vSphere or Hyper-V, then yes, it's completely achievable through a mechanism built into Veeam called Sure Backup. And if they're replicas, or we'll talk about that in a second, Sure Backup uses that same isolated environment that I talked about with that staged restore capability in my last slide, and it fires them up from their backup image into this virtual lab, and it will test that they start up. So it'll look for either VMware tools or Hyper-V integration services starting up inside the machine. They are isolated on the network, so they are, but they are NATed. So it'll ping the NATed IP address. And if you tell it as part of the test what application's running inside that machine, it can run a script to test that application has started as well. So it can actually run a test to probe the ports used by that application and get the expected response. And there are standard tests built into Veeam for things like Active Directory, SQL, web servers, mail servers, etc. But if you've got something that's non-standard you want to test as well, as long as you know what ports it should respond on, you can create a script to test that yourself in Veeam. And all of this is done in an automated fashion, so it will do it, it'll fire them up from the backups. The backups are read-only, so they can't be modified. So it redirects the writes. At the end of the test, it will actually turn those machines it's testing off, discard the changes, and send you a nice little report saying that it was successful. So yeah, in terms of recovering anything that's physical. You can do, for a lot of those things, an instant restore into VMware or Hyper-V, and you could do that into an isolated area and run your own tests on it. Yeah, but restoring onto bare metal is still a time-consuming thing if that's what you want to test. Yeah. But we've done a lot of work to automate a lot of the testing with Sure Backup. You can do the same thing with replicas. If you're replicating machines, unfortunately only on VMware, but if you're replicating machines, then we have the capability to use that Sure Backup capability that we talked about with VMware replicas. We basically snapshot them to test, to then power them up, test them, do exactly the same tests. So we check that it boots, check that we can ping it on an isolated network, check the application, turn it off, discard the changes. Okay, hopefully that gives you some food for thought.
Do we have time for another one?
I'm good at the moment, so
yeah,
I know we overrun a little bit, but
so we have another one. They say after identifying weak points and update the assets list, how can we keep it up to date?
Register up to date. Yeah. It's a good question. It's a very good question, actually. Yeah, you do need. It is a snapshot if you do it at a particular point in time. In fact, actually, you know, it's exactly what a Veeam snapshot would do at a particular point in time. So you having the tools necessary. I'm sorry to plug another product from Veeam, but there is Veeam One as well that will help you monitor these, certainly the infrastructure assets and those IT assets. With the OT side and the industrial control side, there are more and more tools becoming available now from lots of vendors to help you build up that picture of asset and what the particular firmware level and patch level may be of that asset. So really it's about getting that, if you can get the visibility element done first off the bat, then that will say, and automate that, it will save you a lot of pain later on. Over the years, you know, it's been a fairly manual process for a lot of our customers until recently, where there are now more useful OT tools available that can help you with this. It's been in the enterprise, there's been lots of tools available for a very long time, and unfortunately some of them have been in the news recently. If we're talking about security, I think you know the ones I'm talking about, guys, where they've actually, tools have been weaponized. So maybe sometimes having an offline manual asset register may not be a bad thing. I mean, I'd be interested in what you guys think about, you know, some of those approaches, really.
Okay, thanks, Julian. So I think that's it for today. Special thanks to Matt from Tech Data and to Andy for joining us today. As you have seen, industrial resilience and cybersecurity seem complicated and a hell lot of work. But remember, if this isn't your area of expertise, at Polestar we can always help you with the security and system auditing, the creation of the right policies and controls, and the implementation of all the technologies you need to ensure that your business keeps the lights on 24/7. For more content like this, please follow us on social media, where we will be informing you of future events. Thanks to the attendees for your time, and hope to see you in a future session.